My name is Daniel Zibla. I'm a professor of government at Harvard and here at the Center for European Studies. So just wanted to welcome everyone today. It's a great honor and privilege to welcome Ambassador Francis Ricciardoni to Harvard and to the Center for European Studies. Also welcome to all of you as well. So today's lecture is part of our Ozine Forum on Modern Turkey. The forum was established in January 2015 through the generous gift of the Ozine family. The forum supports research and discussions on Turkey and Turkey in the European Union and Turkey's role in the European Union. The annual lecture is the third annual lecture, along with a series of speaking events throughout the academic year comprise the heart of the forum. So our center is really very grateful and proud of our affiliation with Hosni Ozine, who's an alumnus of the Harvard Business School. He's a leading businessman in Turkey and one of Turkey's most impactful philanthropists, especially in the areas of health, education, rural development, and he founded a university, Ozine University, in 2007. I had the pleasure of visiting in 2015, a beautiful campus. So today's lecture is, again, at the third in our annual lecture series. The previous two were wonderful events delivered by Nobel laureate and former President of Finland, Martti Ahtisaari, and former U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense, Elizabeth Sherwood Randall. Today, we're very pleased to welcome Ambassador Francis Ricciardoni. Ambassador Ricciardoni is currently the president of American University in Cairo, where he's been serving for 2 years. Prior to that, he was vice president of the Atlantic Council, focusing on the Middle East. He has had a long and impressive career in the Foreign Service, spanning 36 years, having served as ambassador to Turkey, 2011-2014, Egypt between 2005 and 2008, as well as in Asia. He also served as deputy ambassador to Afghanistan in the late 2000s, as well as has extensive diplomatic experience in Turkey and the broader region. He served as a political advisor to U.S. and Turkish commanding generals of Operation Provide Comfort based in Turkey and in D.C. in the late 1990s. He also worked with Secretary of State Madeleine Albright as a special coordinator for Iraq. So it's wonderful to welcome you here today. Turkey's in the headlines again with these upcoming elections recently called in June. And so we're very excited to hear your remarks. Ambassador Ricciardoni's talk today is titled Resetting Turkey's Strategic Relations West and East. He'll speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, I think. And then we'll open it up for question. Our session will go until 6 p.m. And I also want to let you all know that there will be a reception afterwards upstairs to invite all of you. So, Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor Ziblatt, and to all of you for being here. I'm not only honored but intimidated as I look around and see so much expertise, people I know from past service, whether in Turkey or elsewhere, faculty members here at Harvard. This is an incredible collection of expertise indoors on a beautiful spring day. I also wanted to start by commending this great institution and the Center for European Studies because we'll wind up at where we're starting. I believe that what we're doing here today and what many people in this room do every day really matters in the advancement of American interests and European interests with respect to the rest of the world. I'm a former Cold Warrior. I believe that that relationship is not to be taken for granted, the Atlantic relationship based on not only hardcore shared interests in security and our mutual prosperity, but also our values, whether it's in, you can call it the promotion of democracy. I think of it as promoting human dignity and standards of what it means to be human at this stage of human history. Much of what we did together in this relationship across the Atlantic since the horrors of the great wars of the mid-20th century shaped a liberal, rules-based international order that that needs to evolve, that is being disrupted, but still has enduring value for the United States and basically, I think, everybody who can participate in it. So that you have such a center, the Günzburg Center here at Harvard matters and is impactful. I also wanted to pick up also on Mr. Hosni Ozine, again, because I think we'll end up at that point. that there are people like Mr. Özyeğin, Turks who are successful in life, who have prospered, who have vision, and who support engagement in the world, engagement with the great institutions of learning, which transformed his life, and that he sees as a part of the legacy he wishes to leave, of positive transformation of the country he was born in and the country that he was educated in, is really what it's all about. It's what we can still do, and I think must still do, despite everything, despite the deinstitutionalization that we see going on in some of the conduct of international relationships, some of the disruption, not to say obsolescence or weakening of the institutions of international relations and even the rules that used to guide them. Despite that, because of that, the efforts of influential, visionary individuals, of whom, again, I see some in this room. I see Yalcin Serpil. Thank you so much for coming. People who really care about the United States' role in the world, Europe's role in the world, Turkey's role in the world. As long as we stay engaged at whatever levels we can do it, whether government to government, I think people to people is more important and more impactful now than ever. I choose to be optimistic. I think we'll overcome. In fact, I believe we will overcome. So with this kind of collection of expertise here, I'm not going to sort of lecture you and uphold any grand theories and so forth. I can speak as a practitioner and what I found ways of advancing the American interest as it was then understood. Before we talk about Turkey and its relations with the West, and for that matter, the East, because it's pivotally important to both, I think it is important to just acknowledge the context. When I was a Cold Warrior, when I was in government, there was a pretty broad consensus in most of our countries about our individual countries' roles in the world. There was a broadly shared understanding among Americans of the need for national security and the need to work with allies, the need to confront adversaries, how to do that, the role of military power, the value of investing in institutions of state and statecraft, whether it's the military, whether it's development assistance, whether it was diplomacy. That was broadly understood and has come under question as a result of our national democratic processes. The 2016 elections were all about that. And the outcome of that election reflected a deep national questioning about the rules-based international order and its value to Americans, what it meant for American jobs, American security, and even American cultural and moral values. And we saw that resonating elsewhere throughout the world too. And great scholars, as you have here at Harvard, can analyze why that came about and where it's going, how it is that strong personalities in Russia, in Turkey, in Israel, in different places have come to so dominate their polities and use modern media to advance what might not even be majority sentiments in their individual countries, but are near majorities or at least strong minorities, and then kind of fragment some of this rules-based international order that the benefits of which probably all of us in this room see are obvious. But the non-elites, the non-intellectual elites, the non-governmental elites in our country, the United States of America, and in other countries have come to question very, very severely. That's the context in which we work. So the tools that we used in that order, the standing of America and what a U.S. president says, resolutions of the Congress, statements by high American officials, now have a different kind of or level of impact depending on the context and the national setting. All of those things are changing and changing quickly in the face of this world, especially now where American interests, the conduct of American internal governance and American international relationships are more than ever personalized. I think is the only way you could say it, under a charismatic national leader, much as other countries have charismatic national leaders. And that personalization implies at least a diminishment of the role and the impact of institutions like cabinet agencies of the United States, or the Foreign Service, or the military as such, or our intelligence services, or our law enforcement services. We need to keep that in mind if we're going to look at Turkey and talk about how to engage with Turkey successfully. Again, I emphasize I am no scholar. I commend to anyone who wants to read really good scholarship on this, that of another really a practitioner, a friend of mine from now working with the Carnegie Institute, Mark Pierini, he publishes frequently on Turkey and its relations with Europe. I'm sure if those of you who follow this know his work. The European Commission has just come out, the Council of Europe has just come out with studies on this. There's a lot of great work done. Acknowledging the problems and the challenges is necessary, but it's too easy. There's a lot of issues going on inside Turkey that we can only lament and criticize. I have personal friends in prison, unjustifiably, for sure. These are things that are not to be overlooked. The question is, how do we advance the relationship and hopefully mitigate the individual cases that are there for the moment. They're critically important in this moment, but we're also trying to advance things in the longer and strategic term. What are those enduring interests that Turkey has? Again, they're just so obvious, it seems to me. To the extent America cares about and Europe cares about advancing or catching back up again in progress toward a rules-based, even liberal, international order where economic growth, responsible growth, protection of the environment, upholding human rights standards, labor standards. To the extent we want to continue on that path since World War II, it seems to me obvious we have to stay engaged with each other. And that engagement can be really difficult and challenging when we see behaviors going on in each other's countries or policy decisions that we find unacceptable or just really difficult to swallow. We have to remember it works in both directions. And if we forget that, we will not succeed in influencing other people to our benefit. The kinds of enduring interests I believe there's still a consensus on in our country and I would say broadly among us in Europe are for a relatively stable, non-violent, rules-based international order where trade and investment can flow and can flourish in a well-regulated way so that we don't destroy the environment and choke ourselves off and deny to our children the kind of benefits that we've had. We seem to have, most of us, a consensus that no one country, not even the United States of America, can do that on our own, and that we need to cooperate either in formal alliances that are enduring or in relationships that are transactional and yet effective, where two parties come together or multiple parties come together, we understand each other's interests, and we work effectively on how to advance toward them. With respect to Turkey, it is what it has always been. It is geographically pivotal for anything that humankind wants to undertake in that broad swath of Eurasia. Movements of people, goods, value between Europe and the hydrocarbon-rich Middle East and North Africa. Movements ultimately of ideas, inventions, collaboration together. Turkey is geographically in the middle of all of that. Geography still matters, probably will for a long time, even with modern, instantaneous, basically free mass communications for the flow of value and the flow of ideas. Still, geography matters, and not only in military terms. Cultures matter. The behavior of states, even in a region of failed and failing states, still matters and likely will for quite a while. So Turkey, it remains a pivotally important state. It's a state of a large number of people, 100 million people, puts it in the first tier. It's a leading economy. It seems to me obvious that to the extent Americans care about leading and influencing, or at least influencing the future course of events through diplomacy, through our military deployments, through decisions we make in investment and so forth, Turkey is going to be on our radar and has to be. And dealing with it effectively, as hard as that can be, it's just something we have to do. It's no different a proposition in that regard than dealing with China or Russia or other pivotally important states that have their own interests and are difficult. Egypt, Israel, places that have their own ideas of where they want to go and what they want to do. I plead guilty. I think engagement is just not an option if we're going to stay influential and great and protect ourselves and prosper. Okay, so how do we do that? There's the traditional means of statecraft in a non-traditional world of states that in many cases have failed or disappeared, if you're talking about Libya or Syria or in other forms of crisis like Iraq throughout that whole region. States that are weak, states that have never really abided by the rule of law in quite the same way. And yet we have to deal with them. So there are the political tools or the state-to-state ones in a deinstitutionalizing world where even in a highly institutional and structured state like the United States, personal charisma of a strong leader is now in many ways preponderant. So the political challenges are even greater in a world of fierce nationalisms and xenophobia. Nonetheless, we have to engage in it, and we need to do it skillfully. Coercive measures are always there. When we see another state, whether it's an ally or an adversary, doing things we don't like, you can even contemplate going beyond sanctions and military sorts of things, withholding of favor, withholding of aid, or otherwise punishing. Those things, those are tools of limited effect. They need to be used very skillfully and thought through very, very carefully for second and third order effects. And states that want to wield such instruments as they have them need to be prepared for longer term engagement in those sorts of terms. I see them as full of pitfalls. Doesn't mean you can't use them, but use them with great prudence. Here are the things that I found, not only when I was practicing as a diplomat, but what I find now really work in terms of American and Western influence. European relations with Turkey, European relations with the Middle East, and I think it's fair to almost conflate, again, maybe it's my Cold War thinking, the West. I think of the United States and Europe, for all our differences and issues that we have, we really do come from a common perception of what our national interests are or ought to be, concepts of human dignity, rights to privacy, and so forth. We will argue about how to implement them, but we share the idea that individuals ought to have a right for privacy, that states can intrude on privacy for the benefit of national security, but within limits, that trade is a good thing, the protection of intellectual property is an important thing. All those sorts of things really bring us together with Europe and differentiates the West, I think, from at least the Middle East, of which Turkey is obviously such an integral part. It is not as integrated with the West as many Turks would wish it to be still, and as even the Turkish state from time to time affirms that it wishes to be. So you'll hear me speaking about us, and I really mean the United States and Europe. So I think business works and is a vitally important binder. As much as business competition can separate, it also can bring us together and ought to bring us together with Turkey. It has formal aspirations to joining the European Union that's tattered, it's battered. I don't know because I don't follow it that closely. I imagine it still has a ministry for European Union affairs. It is still the policy of the state to aspire to that. It seems to me that's a good aspiration for us in the West and a good aspiration for Turkey to have somewhere, at least to have in ready reserve. Does it mean we have to pretend that it's going to happen anytime soon? No, it doesn't. We have to be honest and realistic. But that the polity, even a nationalistic, even a xenophobic current polity, can say it's still important for us to aspire to international rules regarding the flow of value of finance and business, intellectual property, business people, goods and services. I think that's pretty important. And at least in a formal sense, Turkey is still there. And within all the political constraints, it seems to be important to keep doing that. People to people. Education, what we do at Harvard, what we do at the American University in Cairo, what Bill Kent does, what Koç University does, what Sabancı University does, what Özyeğin University does, seems to me supremely important, even more important in these times than ever. Why? Because it brings people together internationally, across geography, but even if you suppose that most of the students in the great private internationalist universities of Turkey are almost all Turks, and that most of the scholars are there. This is continuing the impact of the Western liberal, rules-based order, inquiry-based education, science, human advancement, innovation, entrepreneurship. There is nothing more powerful, it seems to me, than the power of international education, and that, from what I can tell, and I am in touch with some colleagues in Turkey, is still thriving, and it is possible to thrive. It takes private sector support, and again, people like Mr. Özyeğin are playing really important roles in that. Science, my wife's a molecular biologist and was at Bill Kent. The science that brings people together in the pursuit of inquiry to crack the great problems that beset us in health or in any field, fintech that is going on, seems to me a really important element of not just leverage, that suggests a coercive I win, you lose sort of dynamic. It is a mutually beneficial dynamic. It works. It worked. It works even between the United States and acknowledged adversaries like China and Russia, and always has, and draws people to the United States, and often Americans will engage in science there. Different branches of science, medicine, for example, art, which flies high above divisions of geography, religion, language, is a powerful instrument of communication and collaboration, and creativity. It feeds human creativity and collaboration in business and in science, going beyond the technical skills that are required to advance. Even entertainment, even tourism, even people who simply come out of curiosity or for a holiday, it seems to me very, very important. I don't know, I used to measure this 4 years ago when I was serving in Turkey. Every time an airplane load, a jumbo jet takes off with 350 people from Istanbul for one of, I guess we had like 7 destinations for nonstops in the United States then. I suppose it's around that now. And the other way around, just do the arithmetic, it's not even math, of the thousands of people coming together for important human collaborations. That's powerful, important stuff. And it affects lives in a way that I think, I choose to believe, will outlast momentary, in historical terms, momentary electoral results in Turkey or in the United States or in London or anywhere else. So those are the things I would invest in. In fact, I am investing in. I went back to the Middle East because I care about this and I believe in it, and I'm at the American University in Cairo because for all the challenges of doing business and interacting in Egypt, that's also a challenging relationship for the United States. There are things that the Egyptian state does that most Americans don't like, reject, and vice versa. There are things about the United States and U.S. culture that Egyptians don't like, policies they don't like. But I don't see any option but to stay very closely intimately engaged in pursuing common interests. You know, that's, people can debate whether we should simply stand back, name, shame, not send U.S. ambassadors to places. That's an option. Or for other countries not to send ambassadors here. That can make a point, that can feel good. It might even have some impact that's desired. I think it has second and third order impacts. I think you have to wonder what's your next move when you do that. I think it's kind of the end of the road when you say, you know, you're so bad, what you're doing is so awful and disgusting that I don't want to have anything to do with you, or I'm going to hold you at more than an arm's length. I understand that emotion. I've served in difficult countries where they do things that I really don't like, personally and officially. But the privilege of serving on the inside, whether you're serving in a U.S. government position or serving in an international educational institution that is impactful, as AUC is, for me has great meaning, and I think is the key to moving forward in national relationships and in improving overall outcomes for humanity. So that's where I come from. That's at a level of generality, but I hope it's provocative enough, because I was just dealing with one young man here who wants to, has a different point of view, and God knows there's lots of other ways of going about it. So why don't I stop there and be glad to sit and take questions, okay?
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll open it up for questions. Identify yourself, please, and I'll call on people. And I'll keep a running tab. If you don't think I've caught you, keep your hand raised. So I'll start here. Yeah.
Hi. My name is Bedal. I'm a first semester senior at college. I think I've done a lot. Okay, it always feels weird. So my name is Bedal. I'm a first semester senior at the college. And I want to ask you a question about the role of the United States in promoting or sustaining democracy. I think this will also interest you. So you were the ambassador to Turkey during the Gezi protests, and that was a time when I think a lot of Turks see as a threshold when the democracy started to really decrease and become worse. And at that point, and I think we can also see this in other countries, with Hungary, with Poland, with all the countries that we see as democracy, you know, let's say, retreating, getting worse. The United States did only take what we call a condemnation attitude. Like the US will go and say, oh, we condemn the recent events in Turkey, or we condemn the recent attitude of the Hungarian government. But unlike the 1950s, during the Cold War, as you also said it, where the United States was taking an active role, that they're not doing that. The United States is not doing that, and the United States is not actively promoting or sustaining democracy. Do you think that the United States in a post-Cold War world can do that? Do you think that you, in your position, see any way that could have gone differently during the Gezi protests, that the United States might have acted differently, maybe come up with sanctions, maybe take a more harsh attitude towards these countries who are clearly choosing a path that is not democratic?
So we can.
One at a time, or do you want?
Yeah, however you would like. I mean, if you would like to respond to that. Other folks, keep your hands raised so I can. If you want, should I collect a couple of questions?
Maybe if there are others along the same lines, we can. This is the promotion of democracy question, and
Okay, so in the back here, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Gonja Samespool. I'm a Fletcher alum. Sorry about the competition, but I'm not tied to them. So you spoke about business interests, and I think everybody in this room would say that business does come across as being a very important factor in relations. However, is there a red line upon which the business interests between a country like Turkey and the United States would take a backseat to other universal values that you had mentioned? Would there ever be a case like that, where business is not that important, or one or the other places or organizations not making money, maybe? Would that ever be more important to talk about universal values of international human rights and freedoms for all peoples. Thank you.
Yes.
You mentioned a lot the historic relationship of Turkey and the transatlantic alliance and the Cold War, and along the same question of democratization and what could the youth have done. Can we go back a little bit further in time than just the Gezi protests, and can we think about perhaps hindsight is 2020, but what could have the U.S. done to promote democratization at a perhaps deeper, more institutional level over the decades?
There's a lot of questions here for you on this, so that's good. Tough questions. Yeah.
So to the question of whether we can and should, I think the answer is, for me, it's an obvious yes. I mean, we can and we should. And I would add to that, we should strive to be effective at it. It is not, to me, it's not satisfying. It's not good enough to simply make declarations or even, close embassies, walked away, slap sanctions on, and then what? We always have to think, what's your next move? We're a rich enough and powerful enough country, we can afford not to, have any relations with North Korea, I guess, and how many other states of the world. And then just what impact do you have once you've done that? There can well be places where that makes sense. The South African apartheid one, comes to mind when we talk about business sanctions and how it works. They're carefully considered ones that were undertaken over a sustained period of time, and we were willing to do that. Arguably, may have led to the undermining of apartheid, encouraged the forces who resisted it, and to read and to hear from the great strugglers against apartheid, the external support really had a great impact. That was a world and a time and a place and a country that was what it was, and it was possible more or less to uphold those. I think we have to continue to do it. To this question about doing business as if doing business means only making money, I think we're all engaged in a business here. Now, the business of higher education is a really important one. The business of medicine, yes, it's curing people of dread diseases, but it is a business with lots of ancillary things. The business of culture and art is also the business of entertainment. Those are businesses. And you can debate whether should artists go and perform in Israel, which is occupying Palestine. There are people who debate that sort of thing, and reasonable people differ on both sides. What impact is it having? Is it leading to changes in national behavior? Those are all worth debating. And so in the abstract, I'm prepared to either support sanctions in some cases, if provided, you target them, you're looking at the second and third order effects, you're prepared to sustain them, you're prepared to deal with the ways that states will evade them. I was involved in dealing with sanctions against Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and that was a state that was really very, very adept at bending the sanctions against its own people, starving its own people, and getting its people to believe that it was the United States that was starving them and not Saddam Hussein. So sure, if you want to advocate, stop our naming and shaming and then put in sanctions, that can be a reasonable response to a problem of another state conducting itself in disgusting, repellent, unacceptable ways. But you need to be prepared to go beyond that, unless you're just happy to do that because we have to do it for our own internal purposes and it's morally the right thing to do. I can accept that too. But let's not deceive ourselves about the likely impact in terms of changing state behaviors.
Do you think the Gezi protests, that was a turning point? Maybe could you say?
Yeah, I think it was a turning point, and I think, honestly, the government of Turkey, I said this to Turkish officials, high Turkish officials, I think they mishandled it. Former President Gül and many in the ruling party at the time, even publicly, it was clear they wanted to handle it a different way from the way that the prime minister handled it. And they chose to represent it as something exogenously inspired. I don't believe it was. It was an important moment for a national conversation in Turkey that had been going on for a long time. But I was there during 3 years, from 2011 to 2014, where there were town meetings about a new constitution, and some of the most conservative people in the ruling party were arguing in American terms for the role of government. You know, less government, that government is best which governs least. I had people in AKP telling me that. The former Minister of Justice and Speaker of Parliament, one of the conservative faction. There was a really rich conversation going on. And in Gezi, it kind of culminated. And the reaction, and it was important to observe that, and as outsiders both respect it, and to the extent we were able and welcome to participate, to do so in a skillful way that didn't enable forces to portray it as a foreign plot. They would do that anyway, and they tried to do that, which was a nonsense. It seemed important to me, when I was there, to let the Turkish voices speak up. And then, where we could, for example, at my 4th of July party, where some ministers walked out, speak truth, and speak but in a respectful way, always respecting the sensitivities, not just of the ruling party, but of Turks, who are no more eager to have foreigners tell them what to do than Americans are eager to have Russians fool around in our elections. Whatever you think of, the two parties in the United States or the outcome, most Americans, even those who support the outcome, are not delighted to think that a foreign party had a meaningful impact in our elections and processes. That's a pretty normal thing. So it shouldn't be shocking to Americans that Egyptians, even who support democratization and a lot of the values that we are seen to be supporting, even they are wary about how we go about supporting them. Some want to wrap themselves in the American flags and use the United States as a battering ram against what they see as dictatorship. And often many of them speak English and have, now thanks to modern communications, instant ties back here. Others want our support and want us to do things to lead an international conversation for our values, but also want that done in a careful way that truly results in support for them and lets Egyptian voices or Turkish voices or Filipino voices or Afghan voices have the lead. So that's what I mean by playing a respectful and ultimately expert role. It's why it's important to learn foreign languages and spend time developing a diplomatic core that understands other countries and cultures from within, not just so we can all be happy and friendly together and pretend there are no problems, but most other countries and cultures understand the United States and America better, much more intimately than Americans understand them. And therefore, they know how to manipulate us better and participate in our political internal conversations and get us to do what they want in their polities than we are able to do there. How many Turks know English? What percent? Probably not a high percent. How many Americans know Turkish? It's a rounding error. How many bother to even try to learn Turkish? Unless you're a Turkish American, right? Or, unless you're some of the enlightened people like the Ayatollahs who are trying to promote American understanding of Turkey from the inside, in its art, in its culture. It doesn't happen. So anyway, that's where I come from. It's not softness. It's not overlooking things we don't like. It's trying to figure out from the inside how to persuade other people that we have a common interest in moving in a certain direction.
Okay, lots of questions. So here. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Lenore Martin. I'm at the Weatherhead Center and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, and first I want to thank Ambassador Ricciardone once again for a very important and insightful talk. I'm going to be a little bit more pointed with my question. And this is, I'm going to go to the issue of the Kurds, because it impacts our policy now in a big way. So here we are. You've importantly accentuated statecraft. We have all known that the Kurdish issue has been a long and distressing issue on issues of human rights and every other aspect that you touched upon today. So the question I have really is, using statecraft, knowing that we are not supposed to interfere with another state's sovereignty directly, what do we do in this situation where we have seen Turkey just devastate the southeast and also make it very difficult for us to operate in Syria? So this is an issue that now has been long festering, we've known about, and now is affecting our policy. What do we do using all of what you spoke about as far as statecraft goes?
So take that, or is there other questions regarding the Kurds?
And not on Kurds. I'm Ersin Kalaycıoğlu from Sabancı University, visiting here at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. We're approaching an election, as you know, which is not going to be either fair or free. Therefore, it's a replay of 1946 elections. The outcome is certain. Short of a miracle, nobody can change that. I'm not so sure whether diplomatically it's possible or not possible to accept the results of such an election as legitimate by the US. Has it ever been done? I don't know. But I'm not expecting any amazing steps so far as that is concerned. I want you to perhaps give you the opportunity to look in the East as well, because Turkey seems to be playing this interesting role with Russia vis-à-vis the US and NATO policies. And that has, of course, electoral impacts. As far as I can tell, nobody's discussing whether Russia is going to play any role in Turkish elections. Surprise? I don't know. Whether Russia would permit anybody else other than Mr. Erdogan to be the Turkish president at this point, because they have such a functional working relationship between the two countries, and wreaking havoc in the West's policy towards the Middle East and elsewhere, as far as I can tell. So what is the overall strategic direction of Turkey so far as you're concerned, between East and West? Is Turkey playing Russia against the US? Is Russia playing Turkey as a wrench that is put into a machine of NATO, US, and playing Turkey and US against each other, using also the Kurds and others for that matter? And is there a real option for Turkey to completely ditch its alliance with the West and move east with Russia, perhaps China or somewhere else? Thank you very much.
Let's maybe take one more question. On a kind of, these are sort of foreign policy type questions. I mean, Kurd is not just that, but yes.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is John Soilu. I'm a fellow at HKS. I wanted to ask you, since we were sort of in the theme of hindsight as 2020 and we were talking about foreign policy, I know this is a difficult question, but knowing what you know now, and obviously you did your best at the time, but knowing what you know now, what would you change if you could change anything in U.S. policy? And I'll give one example. I don't necessarily buy that this was easily doable, but let's assume that Syria was handled differently. Let's assume there was some people in the State Department collected signatures. They wanted a credible strike, like on Kosovo. Let's assume Assad was phased out somehow. And this issue of insecurity via ISIS and this sort of xenophobia through the migrant population scaring off a lot of people in Europe and also in the United States was not exported. I think Brexit would have been different. I think Trump's appeal would have been different. A lot of things would be different. It would also be very different in the absence of both the insecurity and also the refugee problem. If they did not exist, I think also Turkey's Kurdish problem would not be fused with Turkey's own democratic problem. So, like, that's one argument. Like, Syria could have been handled differently, or X could have been handled differently. Knowing what you know now, what would you change in U.S. policy?
About Syria.
Or, like, also as it relates to Turkey.
Hands full there. You don't have to answer everything, of course. Just answer what you would like. It's a lot of. I mean, if I listed all the questions that you asked, that was about 15 questions.
Do this and,
Yeah, I think so.
So we'll do the kind of foreign, I'll tie the Kurds to the last one, the foreign policy one. So there's a lot of good work by Turkish scholars and journalists still, even under the really difficult circumstances going on. Stuff that gets presented at conferences, things that are even published in Turkish, carefully written. People like Aslı Aydın Taşbaş does a lot of good work on the Kurds. Amber Zaman, who's not in Turkey. Somehow managed to be able to go in and out of the country and address these issues. I think it's one of the most pivotally important internal and external foreign policy, even existential questions for the Turkish state. Certainly the Turks have seen it that way, and it isn't just under Mr. Erdogan. It was that way ever since I came into contact with Turkey. They seemed to be making huge headway into figuring out how to balance centralized versus decentralized governance, authority, responsibility even to raise local funds, dispose of state resources, education, a huge degree of cultural tolerance, even celebration, etc. That was happening, and I think most people in here have the expertise on Turkey. I don't need to recap how it crashed and burned, very sadly. But getting to what would we have done, what could we have done, that's an easy one, by the way, for even former diplomats to dodge. We say, well, then was then and now is now, we could talk about, but now we have to deal with the circumstances we face today and where we want to go. And I could do that. But even granting that for Professor Lenore, granting that that's a pivotally important question for Turkey, it's also pivotally and strategically important for Iraq and whatever the future of that state's going to be. Who knows what Syria is going to become or do? And we have no way to engage with Syrian state leaders. We can engage, but we're secondary engagers with the Russians, not at all with the Iranians, who are sort of meddling from afar. Seems to me now what we were doing then, and I can't speak to what we're doing now, but a really deep conversation with Turkey, whatever our differences, and there's some serious ones over the way they're treating American citizens there and so forth. We ought to have a truly strategic conversation about our national interest in regional peace and stability going forward. What do we want or expect with respect to Syria and the nightmare, the continuing nightmare of millions of people who are displaced and maimed for, just think of the simple problem of a lack of education, no education for an entire, what amounts to a generation of students. What does that mean for the stability of the region? Never mind terrorism and fanaticism and all that, but employability. of these millions of people who have had no training in basic skills. And we're not talking about liberal arts education here. We're talking about the ability to weave and to, make T-shirts and things. It is the wreckage of the region is incredible and will have impacts going long, long into the future for refugees and all kinds of extremist ideologies. If we care about this, and we have to care, the United States has to care, I would say morally and ethically, but even if you're putting that aside, if you just care in hard terms of our national security and our interests, we have to care about the wreckage of Syria. And oh, by the way, Libya and a few other, Yemen and a few other places out there. How do we deal with that if not with Turkey, not because they're NATO allies, as they are, not because we profess shared values, we profess them, we may or may not have them, but because we must, on its face, have a hardcore shared strategic interest in what happens in Syria and having secure borders, secure Turkish borders against all manner of crime and violence that could spill in, whether criminal or terrorist or any other way. Turkey cares about having a stable Iraq and a stable Syria, whatever they are to be, whatever their complexion or color. They have a greater stake than we do in it, a greater stake than even the Russians and the Iranians have. And they are going to do whatever they think they need to do to protect that interest. So it seems to me we ought to have a really deep conversation with the Turks, understanding each other's worldviews very deeply. In this, something I found as an American practitioner, we've not dealt with Turkey as adeptly as I think we could have over the years for some structural reasons in our government. We put Turkey into the European Bureau of the State Department and of the Pentagon, EUCOM, out of Brussels, as opposed to CENTCOM out of the Gulf and Florida, and for the CIA, and for the most other functions of government we do. And that made sense on its face. Administratively, you've got to do these things. And Turkey aspired to be integrated into the West, and we wanted that. So that all made sense. But when it came to dealing with the Kurds and fanatics, violent fanatics from the East, we were not so well equipped. And when that became a priority under the Obama administration, it wasn't just under President Trump, we deployed people to speak with the Turks who mainly were coming from the perspective of defeating ISIS at all costs. I certainly subscribe to that. I think that's very important. But the way to really defeat that awfulness, I think, would have been to have a greater mind meld if it was possible. And I'm sure we tried. I've been out of government since the summer of 14 when Daesh or ISIS burst on the scene. But the last strategic conversations I had were with the Turks in Washington in July of 14 on how to deal with this emerging threat from a common perspective and looking at the Kurdish situation and what to do about the PKK and the YPG manifestation of the PKK, and could we have done it? I was not satisfied at the quality of the conversation as I saw it shaping up even then. We needed people to deal with this who understood the Turkish perspective of being both of the West and of the East. And the leading element of the United States engagement was very much from a Middle East military command, Middle East intelligence, Middle East diplomacy aspect, undervaluing the Turkish adhesion to NATO and even the Turkish self-identity of being the eastern edge of the West. I don't think we got that quite right. And as to this other question about what would we do, could we do, should we do, all that, with respect to Syria, I think it's important. It was important then, and this was the frustration American diplomats found then and military people, it's always important in statecraft to mean what you say and say what you mean. It's not enough to give speeches and think that speeches are going to put you on the right side of history, or that speeches are important and your credibility really matters, but you had better not throw around words like red lines unless you mean it. And then it's fair. You can debate it in our polity. You know, it might be right to set a red line or not right. You'd work it through our political system. You come to a conclusion. And if a president of the United States says, this is a red line, then I had to presume as a diplomat, he thought about what that meant and not only what he was saying, but what others were hearing. And if you don't mean what you say, then you're going to lose credibility very, very quickly. And if you lose credibility, it's like losing your health. You value it when you've lost it. When you're living in good health, you just enjoy it, and when you lose it, then you suddenly realize how valuable it was. I had the privilege of serving when people believed what the United States said and what the President of the United States said, and it was considered, and it was studied. It could be right, could be wrong. It was worked out through our great democracy, through debates in the Congress, through hearings, through our media. And when the President would make a speech and give a directive, we knew what that meant. So I guess that's the one thing I would say about the past that I think is salient for today. And same with the Kurds. I don't know how the United States interprets our interests with respect to the Kurds as such, whether the Kurds of Turkey or the Kurds of Iraq or the Kurds of Syria. I follow this. Probably scholars in this room, certainly I hope you follow it more closely than I can. But I hope we're having a really intimate conversation with Ankara on and developing a shared vision of this.
I'm the former director of the Middle East Center here, as well as the former director of the Middle East Center at the University of Chicago. So I've been watching the events in the Middle East with a jaundiced eye for a long time. I'm greatly tempted to ask you, before I get to my question, thank you so much for this very friendly and very nice, very interesting discussion about your experiences in Turkey. I'm greatly tempted to ask you about your take on the difference between Egypt and Turkey, because you've been in Egypt, and Egypt is going through some very difficult times. And American policy on Egypt is also in question. Then there is Saudi Arabia, there's Israel. But I will refrain from asking that question because there's another more urgent question, which is around this matter of the Kurds. That is to say, the reason why there is such negativity towards America in Turkey right at this moment, for good reason or the wrong reasons, is because it is seen, the perception is that American policy involved with others in the Middle East, let me not name them, to create a Kurdish state in the south, which includes the Turkish Kurds. That's the perception. And as long as that perception remains, life will be very difficult because Turks will not accept that. They will not accept it for a variety of reasons, because the conservative Kurds in Turkey are all voting for Erdogan. And that's a fact that neither the Europeans nor the Americans really realize. A lot of Kurds don't want a state dominated by the PKK. They want a state that is like Barzani, friendly to Turkey. So whether that can be managed or not, I don't know. But what is your take on American policy on these difficult matters?
Ambassador, you suggested that, people, my name is Ayşe Kadıoğlu. I'm from Sabancı University, currently a visiting scholar here at Center for European Studies. You suggested that, business relations, in fact, should go on and, they have a lot to offer in terms of promoting democratization. You even mentioned art. But business also needs, of course, security. Security of private property, security from not receiving tax penalties. So there are all those issues that also concern the businesses, when it comes to that. But I do get your point. You're basically saying we should continue to do what we do, not throw the bridges, because basically there's, that's what people do. But then on the one hand, there are those, who argue that Professor Kalaycıoğlu was, alluding to the elections. The results are clear. So, kind of like game over. But then there are others, who still think that, there are certain things that can be done. Now, I'm going to continue and ask the question that Professor Yalma didn't ask. You are someone, you speak Turkish, you were very, you had relations with the society. You're one of those ambassadors with relations to the society. You have a feel for the society, that I know. So comparing Turkey with Egypt right now, given the fact that, some prominent civil society promoters have been jailed, at the moment. But still, I read in Washington Post recently, like last week, that someone says when you compare Turkey to Egypt and Russia, let's say in the region, there is still a desire for democracy. So we all go back and forth, of course. When we look at the situation on ground, everything tells us that, we should be pessimistic. There's a state of emergency. Elections are, happening during a state of emergency. Some, opposition political leaders are in jail. This is the kind of thing that we have on ground. But do you still have hopes with the civil society in Turkey? Can you compare it with Egypt, for instance?
Answer both of these, since they kind of go together. Yeah, sure, yeah.
The simple answer is yes, I do have hope and belief from my experience. It's that's because it's a nice thing to say, but it's what I truly believe from a wide, just from all those experiences over. I remember I first went there as a tourist in, what was that, Marie, the summer of 76 or 77. We were from Iran, and then came in as a diplomat in 79, and then all those years. The civil society now is a word in the Arab world, I don't know about in Turkey, has been made poisonous or radioactive. But I think what is meant by it exists in those places in the Arab world and certainly exists in Turkey. I find a resilience that is there that is deep. And it goes to conservative religious elements. It goes to a national identity that is not a colonial layover. It's the core of what was Ottomanism. And even before the Ottomans, there was an Anatolian identity that the Ottomans sort of brought forward, and it's taken deep root. And the modern experiment of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk sort of took that and it advanced it to a certain place through the 20th century. There's a modern state in Turkey that I don't believe is going to fragment. I don't think the people want it, and I think there's a national identity that's strong. And partly, as Elaine, I think you mentioned it, right? No, Professor, you mentioned it. Conservative Kurds even do not want a PKK separatist state. I just never found that. So I'm very confident that the state's going to stay together, that the polity will find its way forward. This is a journey. All these countries, this is a never-ending story. Let's remember that, huh? This is not a happy time in history for a lot of countries. A lot of countries. depending where they are. And I think that Turkey and its polity has a solid level of education that Egypt does not have. In Egypt, the Egyptians recognize that they've got to work on their educational system. Literacy is a basic problem. Literacy in Egypt. You can debate the numbers, but at the very least, it's 20% of Egyptians are illiterate, and functional illiteracy may be even higher. Turkey, there is no illiteracy. All the other measures of advancement and development of caloric intake, access to clean water and sewage, those have been improving a lot in Egypt, but the middle class of Turkey is not suffering in terms of everyday access to education and a dignified life and caloric intake and shelter and clothing and so forth, public goods, even security, in the way that the middle class of Egypt is really being squeezed under the economic conditions there. So it's hard to, there are certain parallels, it's apples and oranges, there's some similarities, but there's a lot of differences. I'm quite confident that, Turkey is on a journey. It's one that goes up and down in terms of different measures. So is the United States of America, right? And any country. But the long-run trajectory, I think, is of a country that is pretty well educated and keeps investing in education, keeps renewing its physical infrastructure and its human infrastructure, I think. We can argue about you can't say there's a liberal polity. You can argue about the state of rule of law and so forth. Those are sad, I think. But in the long run, the people seem to want a well-ordered society based on the rule of law with gender equality. That's another thing. Is it perfect or even close to perfect in Turkey? No, it's not. Is it perfect in this country? No, it's not. But it's way ahead of other countries in that region. It makes Turkey much more like the West than like the East. So yeah, I'm optimistic, and I choose to be optimistic too about Turkey. Egypt is finding its way also. Egypt has been traumatized in a way that Turkey has not. Turkey has not faced a revolution. There are political changes through elections. People argue about the legitimacy of elections, but at the end of the day, Turks accept it. They accept this is an outcome. Nobody has a doubt of who is the president of Turkey, and the rest of the world respects Turkish political processes, just the way we expect the rest of the world to respect American political processes. This was not a majority vote, right, in the 2016 elections, but the Americans have our processes, and we expect the rest of the world to respect that the American people chose Donald Trump through legitimate processes. I do, and I think everybody here respects that this is the outcome we got, and this is a legitimate election. It's the same it's not the same. You can say people question the very legitimacy, but the outside states have no choice but to deal with the government and leadership of Turkey as elected in its own processes. Same in Egypt. The Egyptians have their own processes. Egyptians themselves debate them, question them, sometimes with humor, sometimes bitter humor. But at the end of the day, they accept that they have a legitimate government and a legitimate president, and the rest of the world has no choice but to deal with that fact and have the best relations we can have with it. I think. That's how I look at it.
I'm sorry, do you want to?
Answer. So civil society, yes, I believe it's there. Business trust and confidence. At the end of the day, the rule of law is really important to enable business and investment and people to move. Business is about trust. Business in its higher sense, not business in the sense of profiteering or making money out of misfortune and that sort of thing. But the exchange of having agreements that can be enforced, not only because you and I trust each other, we think we're honest people, but at the end of the day, there's a system to enforce protection of intellectual property, enforce contracts. That may have been damaged in Turkey recently. People argue about whether it's damaged in this country through political means, but it's still there. The United States is still a place where people have trust in the rule of law to protect business transactions, and in Turkey, people still trust there's sufficient rule of law to protect business transactions. That seems to be really important.
Can I just follow up on one point here? So at what point, though, do, these elections coming in June, at some point, the playing field is so tilted that whatever the incumbent says, the opposition begins to regard the elections as basically illegitimate? I mean, is that a prospect? I mean, one could imagine that happening in the United States, could one imagine that happening in Turkey? And at what point, what is the probability you would attach to that, and what things would you look for?
It's hard to say when the line is crossed, but if there's a process where people lose confidence in the legitimacy of their governmental processes, that's a bad course to be on. That's dangerous. If Americans begin to distrust the vote and think that everything's fake news or fake electoral processes, if Americans begin to believe that, we're not headed into a good place, I think. And the same is true in any other country, whether it's Turkey or somewhere else. If people believe that there's a deliberate act of deception by those in power and the elites, and the elites who are in power are not representing them through a legitimate process, that is not a positive direction. It doesn't lead to a good place. I don't live in Turkey. I don't know. From what I deduce, a majority of Turks believe they have a legitimate government and that their processes are legitimate. Even many of those who don't like the results, nonetheless, at the very least, tolerate them. It may be faute de mieux, because they don't see any alternative. But we on the outside really don't have much choice, it seems to me, either, but to respect what comes out of these things. Just as I don't think any other countries have any choice but to respect the results of our processes.
Yes. Oh.
Thank you. My name is Richard Rosen. I'm a retired scholar. Since I've been studying foreign policy informally since, say, the 1960s and the war in Vietnam, my concern is that when people like you, and it's not just you, needless to say, come from the State Department and the U.S. government and speak at Harvard, MIT, wherever, you assume somehow that there's one strategic interest or one set of security interests that all Americans support, which is, just not true. I mean, it's just plain old State Department propaganda. I mean, we've had huge disagreements on every war that the U.S. has participated in, as I say, since at least the 60s, whether it was in Vietnam, Chile, Honduras, Iraq, you name it. So why do you talk like that? I mean, we have very different views of what's appropriate. The U.S. doesn't follow any rule of international law. The U.S. is the most egregious aggressor in the world. My view is you don't follow the rule of law when you arm, troops, dissidents in, say, Syria or Iraq or anywhere else. That's not the rule of law. That's what the U.S. feels like doing. There's no law that says the U.S. can do that. There's no law that says the U.S. should send drones around the world and kill people, right? That's not legal. So I don't know why you take this whole approach that we're all in agreement about what should happen.
I actually don't think we're all in agreement. What I'm saying is we have, and I'm not from the State Department. Remember, I left the State Department 4 years ago. I was delighted to leave the State Department. There's nothing I'd rather have done. I was very proud to serve in our thing. But I don't think nobody I know in the State Department says there's unanimity of opinion in the United States. But what we have to do when you're in government service, and we only do it wholeheartedly, is swear to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. And we have constitutional processes that are there. and they lead to results. And it usually doesn't mean that there's unanimous national opinion on this or that issue, whether it's an internal one or an external one. And I've never known an American diplomat to say we're unanimously behind bombing this place or bombing that place, or putting development assistance in. There's a rich debate, typically, it used to be, in the Congress and in our media. The debate produces results, often laws, usually speeches, and then sometimes even elections that lead to changes of it. But there was a greater consensus that American engagement with the world is important, that American national security is really important, that the way you uphold it is through defense and through law enforcement and through intelligence. These ought to be resourced. There was a broad consensus about that. I think that consensus, from what I can tell, is frayed. So that's not to say that it's unanimity or nothing, by any means.
Thank you, Ambassador. Haifa Al-Kailani, I'm a fellow of the Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative. Back to the Middle East region and the role of Turkey. We are well aware of the enhanced and increased business relations and business ties between Turkey and the Arab region, starting with the Gulf states, Iraq, Egypt, even North Africa. Recently, we have been also seeing closer ties, political ties, between Turkey and Iran. How do you reconcile that? And how do you see that will impact or impair the economic and business very strong ties between the Arab world and Turkey? Thank you.
Maybe get one more question. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Isabel Finkel. I was a journalist in Istanbul for, I think, the latter part of your tenure and 3 years after that as well. My question is also about what happens inside the State Department from a slightly different angle. The period when I was reporting from Turkey and when you were there was a time of really vicious kind of personal attacks on you and particularly on your successor in the Turkish press. And I'm interested to know whether they seemed unprecedented, what the State Department thought about them, how it was proposed to deal with them, whether you think that strategy worked, and whether in any subtle way you think that they had an effect on policy. These sort of aren't questions I have presupposed answers to, but I'd love to know what you think.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. To your question about Turkish-Arab business ties in the Gulf and North Africa, it also reminds me, I didn't respond to the question earlier from someone about the Turks playing off the Russians. And yeah, I'm sorry. It's not surprising to me at all that Turkey should seek to maximize its advantage in trade, or for that matter, political relations with its near neighbors, as well as the, what Americans consider to be offshore balancing, balancing the distant powers and their relationships versus the near ones. Turkey, since before the time of the Republic, was very adept at international sort of power, perceiving an international context in which it would make different moves, whether military moves or economic ones, who you sent gifts to and envoys to and all that sort of thing. So, its economic ties are fraught. It got gummed up in a not very adroit way with this whole Qatari internecine Arab family fight, which I've been unfortunate, I think, for Turkish interests throughout the Arab world, but, works for Turkish-Qatari relations. Those are tricky things to get right. I wouldn't presume to tell the Turks how to conduct their economic relations with the other states. We want them to respect Iran sanctions. That's an American interest. Playing off the Russians, too, and people asked about that. That's an old and understandable game of statecraft. You work with one power that has interests that parallel yours in this area, and you balance off versus those in another area. To that question of the NATO alliance and what's conceivable and not conceivable, the NATO alliance is a voluntary association of members with membership standards, and it's, no one's forced to be a member of NATO. It's something that states adhere to when they commit to, and they stay with when they believe it's in their interest, the common defense and advancing common interests within NATO and in the NATO area of interest is a matter of state importance. So I don't find any of this, shocking or difficult to understand. That Turkey should be trying to trade with Iran or having challenges in its dealings with different Arab states are all things that, whether under this government or previous ones, it's always striven to maximize its advantage. Remember the zero problems with neighbor policy of only a decade ago, or less than a decade while I was still there. That was working. And for Ms. Finkel, personal attacks, it's part of being in public life. I actually thought I had a pretty good time of it in Turkey. I guess I never worried about it too much. I just tried to speak honestly and respectfully in private and in public, and on the whole, I thought I got a pretty good treatment of it. There are people in the state media now and then wanted to go after the United States, but that kind of stuff that was orchestrated, I would go in and have a friendly little chat with the people who I thought were directing them, and said, well, let's just talk about this a little bit and see what you mean. And, it would either go away or it wouldn't, and we managed. It's just part of the cost of doing business. Unless I thought as the American representative, I didn't have to comment on everything. I deliberately did not use Twitter. We were encouraged at that time. I got a Twitter handle, I got a verified signature stuff. And I just decided not only is it not respectful, it's not impactful to always, as the American ambassador, be commenting on everything. You should not set up an expectation that you're always going to comment. You should let people have their own conversation, it seems to me. And from time to time, participate, especially when invited, and not when invited by one partisan side that wanted to use you against another one. You had to be careful of that. So I rather enjoyed dealing with the Turkish media. I thought I had the privilege of being on TV with Mehmet Ali Birand, God bless him, people like that. And, they'd ask provocative questions, and it was kind of fun. I never really minded it. The serious journalists.
Just on that last point about the Twitter, is that something, is that something that if you were to do it again, or going forward, if you were in an ambassadorial position, would you, you think that's the right thing to do, or does it depend on the country that one's serving in, or do you have a general?
When you're in a position of power, like an American diplomat, you don't have, being a little reserved can really sustain your capital of credibility. And then people want your opinion. And you usually have more impact when people really want to know what you think, instead of constantly being in people's face on everything. So I would still, look, I'm a university president now. And here at Harvard, I went to university president school 2 years ago. And I learned a lot. It was a wonderful, I did. It was a wonderful 1-week course. And I do commercials for this for Harvard.
This is at the, where was this? At the Kennedy?
It's the Graduate School of Education.
Education.
Yeah. And there's questions about that. And we also have university presidents using social media. And there are university presidents who are constantly on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. And I would just find it exhausting. How do you have time to think strategically and engage with people? Maybe it's age, I enjoy face-to-face meetings with people, and I like longer conversations than 128 character. I guess that limit is no longer there in Twitter, right? It's expanded. So no, I wouldn't recommend it it might be good to use from time to time if you can be disciplined and only comment when you want to use it.
Yeah. Yes, in the back.
Hi, I'm Ogden Ross, and my question has to do with the nature of democracy. That Erdogan at this point seems to have assumed presidency for life, like Putin claims he's not, but probably is, and Xi Jinping did as well. And then he uses the illusion of the Ottoman, which you brought up, and also he's kind of the restoration of Ataturk. But this stems back to the notion of democracy. When the Muslim Brotherhood went into Egypt, largely as a result of the Arab Spring, was viewed by the West kind of as the sole democratizing influence, and which then El-Sisi basically used a constitutional caveat to overthrow the government, which makes me wonder if democracy is really useful as a word in these regimes. I mean, we claim Assad as a regime, we claim everybody under the sun as a regime as long as they don't agree with the United States. Even Erdogan is probably a regime also. So could you just clarify the nature of democracy and whether it's really true or is fake?
I think that's your book is about that.
Yeah.
I'm going to read Professor Ziblatt's book and look for the answers to those questions. So the answer is no, I could not clarify, but I'm going to read this book.
Yeah, right, it's good to
Next.
to know your limits, right? I think there's one more question, yeah.
Hello, my name is Stratos Efthymiou. I'm the Consul General of Greece, and I used to serve in Ankara when you were as ambassador there. So my question is, how much do you think Erdogan is inclined to use foreign policy for domestic purposes, especially in the next coming months of the elections? I remember the Simon Peres incident. In Greece, but also in Turkey, there's a perception that the 1996 crisis between Greece and Turkey was used by Prime Minister Çiller to increase her popularity. So there might be a temptation in the coming months.
Maybe collect one more question. We're about, this may be our last time round. Oh, you second time, okay, go ahead.
I just have a quick sort of follow-up question. You talked about credibility a little bit, and I would argue that as you said, when we have deinstitutionalization and when leadership is so personalized, what kind of credibility does an ambassador have if you are like sitting across the room? What kind of deliverables do you have? And do you think, did you ever felt like you were being cut in any way when you were ambassador, that there were things you want, to the extent that you can share, obviously?
Yeah. Maybe I'll just throw in one last one. I think maybe this will be the last round. But to what you were emphasizing the continuities in Turkish foreign policy, that these things, that the games that are being played are not new. But one would think that with a transformation of the regime that has undeniably taken place, whether or not one wants to call it authoritarian or not, there's been a transformation. Has there been a fundamental change in the way? Looking at it from the outside, I guess now, in the way that foreign policy is being conducted, and what is that, or is this just really sort of more of the same? That's what the processes you're describing.
So to go to several comments, yes, of course, that's what I meant by deinstitutionalization, and it is not peculiar to Turkey. Foreign policy is being conducted in a very different way, which has disrupted the old ways, and social media is a part of it, and Twitter is a part of it, and charismatic national and nationalist leaders are all part of that. So in a way, it does deinstitutionalize foreign ministries and ambassadors and embassies, because the communication from the top to broad publics goes straight out from the cell phone of a leader. So that they've de-emphasized the sort of plodding machinery, the thoughtful sort of institutional analysis, collecting of information and bringing data to bear and all of that. So that's just a fact. That's the way things are going. I never felt personally undercut. And going back again to Ms. Finkel, you asked, I felt nothing but support from Washington when I needed it. It would have been obvious if I didn't have it, I would have been removed. Or there would have been some counter statement, and there wasn't. And when necessary, there were positive statements from Washington echoing. So I never felt undercut. But the system in today's world is not, the practice of diplomacy is an evolution from the 19th century Congress of Vienna days. And so disruption is a fact of life. And that's why, for example, the State Department was encouraging ambassadors to use Twitter to get with it. And some used it effectively. I just couldn't and didn't. It's a style thing. Will this or that government in any country use foreign policy to domestic political advantage? Well, of course. In any democracy or autocracy, xenophobia plays. I don't want to be too pointed about making American references, but blaming the other and foreign devils and foreign people taking our jobs, and this is a hearty staple in anybody's democracy, and certainly in Turkey and in the Middle East, people blame others for problems, and sometimes there's a 0% of truth, and sometimes there's 100%, but usually the percentage is somewhere in between those two poles. So I don't find that at all unusual or remarkable. It may be reprehensible, it may be not convincing, but that unusual or peculiar, hard to understand? No, I don't find it any of those things.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you very much, and I would like everybody to join me. Thank you very much. People are able to go back to Turkey or